So between 2016 and 2017, Singapore had a 31% drop in reproduction.
Wow.
And Macau, which had a 26% drop in reproduction.
Hmm.
South Korea had an 11% drop in reproduction. All of those started out at reproductive levels below 60% of replacement levels.
No kidding.
And so in South Korea, the figures are available now for the first 6 months of 2018, and there was another approximate 9% drop in reproduction.
Wow.
In South Korea. So, I can't tell you for certain that all of this is caused by EMFs, but we simply don't have any other hypothesis that makes any sense that explains these things.
Sure.
The other thing I can say that I can say for certain is that the only times when one normally sees these kinds of drops in reproduction are when you have either a war or a famine or a huge economic collapse.
Oh.
And clearly none of those are relevant to those three countries.
Sure.
So, we're in an extraordinary situation, and I think that, and you can make an estimate of how long it's going to take for us to crash, for our reproduction to crash pretty close to zero in ways that, based on the animal studies and also based on what we know about human infertility, are probably going to be irreversible. And the estimate is something like 5 years. But some of these countries that are already crashing, like the three I mentioned before, it may be much less than that. And so we're looking now. That's completely apart, as I say, from 5G and further expansion of 4G, further expansion of putting radar units in cars so they can drive and park themselves and keep you out of harm's way in other ways. And so electronics in vehicles are becoming more and more active, as you may know. So there are many threats in this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I know that pulsed electromagnetic frequencies tend to be more damaging biologically and so forth. That's the case, correct?
I'm sorry. What was your first? I didn't catch.
I'm sorry about that. Pulsed. Yeah, pulsed EMF. Yeah.
So there are what I think 13 reviews that have been published which show that pulsed EMF, electromagnetic fields that pulse up and down rapidly, are in most cases much more biologically active than our non-pulsed EMFs, and that's problematic in part because every single wireless communication device, we've got many of them, communicate at least in part via pulsation. So, so the radiation that we have from Wi-Fi, from cell phones, and particularly smartphones, the smarter they are, the more they pulse, and from cell phone towers and from smart meters and so forth. And all of these things are highly pulsed, and they are therefore potentially, and I believe actually, much more dangerous as a consequence of that. And so that's a huge issue, and it's one that's universally ignored by the industry. It's universally ignored by the regulatory agencies. And so, we have no protection from the regulatory agencies from our health. It's absolute, the regulatory guidelines are absolute nonsense.
I've seen the Harvard study, FCC, a captured agency. I think it just basically says we're dealing with standards that are 30 years out of date, and the revolving door between the FCC and the telecom companies is blatant, and they're not coming close to representing us on a public health level, I suppose.
Well, that's certainly true, and since the FCC has taken over the regulation particularly the cell phone towers. They have, that was based on the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which was, I think, one of the most corrupt pieces of legislation that's ever passed. What happened was that, since that time, and the FCC has done nothing to look into what the actual safety guidelines should be. So, they've gone for 23 years not doing anything that they should be doing. Rather, what they're doing is pushing these technologies on us, including very actively 5G. But let me just say, when you say 30 years ago, actually 30 years ago, we already knew that these safety guidelines were bogus. There was a large amount of evidence going way back to the 1950s and 1960s that they were bogus, and in fact, some people have argued that actually back in the 1930s we knew they were bogus. I'm going back to that earlier literature, the 1930s literature, but I have looked at a fair amount of the 50s, 60s literature, and I know that there's a large amount of information in that literature showing that there are, that the current safety guidelines, which are entirely based on heating effects, what are called thermal effects, that they were clearly known not to be true. In fact, there were 3 U.S. government reports that showed they weren't true. One of them from the U.S. Office of Naval Medical Research in 1971. Another one was from NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration report that was published in 1981. And then there was another one that was done in 1986. So the U.S. government recognized that there were non-thermal effects. And in fact, in the 1980s, we had safety guidelines that recognized the role of pulsations. And so the safety guidelines in the U.S. and in Canada and one other country during that time were recognized that pulsations made things much worse, and they had more stringent safety guidelines. Now we don't have any of that.
Oh, wow.
So, everything has done, and let me just say the research in this area used to be funded by the government so that you could get some decent research done in the U.S. That research funding basically disappeared between 1986 and 1999. And so that it's essentially impossible to get government funding, which means in the U.S., which means the only funding we have is from the industry, if it's incredible conflicts of interest. So, now, there are other countries that are, in fact, doing good research in this area, fortunately. But they're not the countries you would expect to be doing good research. So, it's really quite, maybe I shouldn't have said that quite that clearly. They're not the countries that are most known for their scientific prowess.
Gotcha.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Can I ask you, on page 3, and I think we're talking about DNA breaks and just some of the consequence of, it's a lot of the, so just to clarify for folks, when they talk about non-ionizing radiation, ionizing radiation would be like gamma rays, and there's heating associated with ionizing radiation. Is that correct to say?
Well, the ionizing radiation works via free radical attacks on the DNA.
Okay.
But what the industry has claimed is that non-ionizing radiation works entirely via heating, via thermal effects. And we know that's not true. I mean, there are good studies that have been done that have shown that you get, under certain circumstances, you get biological effects at average intensities that are 5 orders of magnitude below what's allowed by the safety guidelines. So, in other words, 100,000 times lower than what the safety guidelines.
Oh.
We can actually get high level effects at those low levels. Now, this is dependent on, what kind of cell type you're looking at, what kind of response you're looking at. It's dependent on what kind of EMFs you have. But, of course, with the pulsations we've talked about, there are other variables that also influence, what effects you get. Anyway, yeah, the whole thing. So you want me to talk about the DNA effects and what their consequences are?
Well, on page 3, I think it's referring to, and you mentioned free radicals. Now, the mechanics of the EMFs cause activation of the voltage-gated calcium channels in our cells, and there are free radicals that emerge as a consequence of that. Is that correct? Like superoxide dismutase? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, basically what happens is that the EMFs activate these voltage-gated calcium channels, which I usually abbreviate VGCCs, and they let excessive calcium flow into the cell. And the excessive calcium produces a number of effects, and some of the most serious of those involve increases in peroxynitrite, which is a potent oxidant which breaks down to form highly reactive free radicals that attack the DNA. And so that's not the only thing peroxynitrite does in this system, but it's obviously very important. So what we find is that many of the exposures that we're exposed to all the time, in fact, produce DNA effects in our cells, and those include Wi-Fi, they include cell phone radiation, they include cell phone tower radiation, they include I think those three are quite well documented. They no doubt include many other things. So it's a huge problem, and part of the reason why these electromagnetic fields are so dangerous is because when you look at the sequence of events which occurs between EMFs, the action of the EMFs, and the actual production of peroxynitrite and free radicals, there are 3 steps in that process which involve very high levels of amplification.
Okay. And
what that means is that very low intensities of these EMFs can in fact produce quite high effects. And so this turns the industry propaganda on its head, because the industry propaganda has been claiming that ionizing radiation is dangerous, and this non-ionizing radiation, which includes these microwave frequencies that we've been talking about, are not dangerous because all they can do, according to the industry, is heat things. Well, in this case, you can get actually much more DNA effects, at least in certain cell types under certain conditions, from very low amounts of microwave frequency EMFs than you get with a similar energy level of ionizing radiation.
Okay.
So, by that criterion, and you have to look at the conditions. This microwave frequency radiation we're all exposed to can be, in fact, much more dangerous than ionizing radiation of a comparable exposure level. Wow. So everything that's been argued is just wrong, and so we are in extraordinarily deep trouble. Let me just say that and of course people have been concerned about cancer causation, and cancer, of course, is known to be caused by these DNA effects causing mutations in the cells of our bodies, but I think what may be, in fact, a much more concerning issue is what happens when you get lots of mutations in the germline cells, including human sperm. And we know that human sperm, you get these DNA effects from the kinds of exposures that many of us are exposed to every day. And so that's a major concern. And I have to say,